Part 1. Sea Breeze. A cool breeze carries with it the scent of the salty sea. The first few rays of the rising sun cast an orange glow across the grassy fields that covered the distance between the sparkling waves and a small house. The wind caused the long blades of grass to bend and curl in a way that gave the field the appearance of being merely an extension of the wavy sea. The house rested atop a hill, and sitting near the building was a man who had called it home for the last 8 years. Curled up against the man was a small creature with light-colored fur. It kicked out its hind legs a few times in its sleep. A soft smile dawned on the man's face as he pet his furry companion, knowing that it was quite early for either of them to be out of bed. The man simply wanted to take in as much as he could before he had to say goodbye to it all. As the sun rose higher, the man thought he had heard something behind him. He turned his head a little to see if he could hear anything else, and was just about to give up when the little Pokemon sleeping next to him twitched its long, pointed ear and looked up. Looking down at his companion, he gave a nod as if they were both thinking the same thing. "She's coming," he whispered. Standing up on all fours, the Pokemon waved its full tail excitedly and stared at the door to the house. As footsteps grew closer to the door, the creature wiggled with excitement, and the moment the door started to slide open, the pale-furred Pokemon let out a yip and leapt toward the unsuspecting girl. With a squeal, the girl fell backward and wrestled the Pokemon, giggling as she attempted to protect her face from getting licked.
Okay, stop, V. No, V, stop!
The man grinned wide and got to his feet. He sent out a sharp whistle that caught the Pokemon's attention, and then he jerked his head back over his shoulder and reached out one arm. Immediately, the pale Eevee rushed over, bound up the man's arm, gave the man's cheek a quick lick, and then rested upon his shoulder. "Good morning, Violet." He stepped over to the girl and helped her back to her feet. Using a sleeve to wipe her face, she looked over at the rising sun and then back at the man and said,
"Why are you up so early?"
He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Actually, I'm surprised you could. I'd think the excitement of starting your journey as a Pokemon trainer would have prevented it." The girl looked down as she dug a toe into the dirt.
Well, I didn't think I could either, and was really trying hard to decide what Pokemon I would choose depending on my options. And I was sitting on the floor looking through different books, and then, well, I must have collapsed with exhaustion. Next thing I knew, I was waking up on the floor with a page stuck to my face.
The man let out a hearty laugh and then nodded in understanding. "That is more of what I would have expected from my daughter." He wrapped an arm around Violet and gave her a squeeze while he turned and faced the sun that had now risen high enough to start returning much of the usual colors to the grass and sea. He took a deep breath of the salty air and said, "Well, we have a few hours yet before we need to head into Cerulean. How about we start the day off with some French toast?" The girl nodded, and the two of them, along with V, went inside to enjoy some breakfast. Part 2. Into Cerulean. The aroma of fresh French toast lingered in the air as Midori, Violet, and V embarked on the road to Cerulean City. The sun painted the sky with hues of blue and gold, casting a warm glow over the winding path. The trio strolled through the fields, enjoying the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the sea. As they approached Cerulean City, its distinct architecture came into view. The vibrant colors of the buildings reflected in the cerulean waters that surrounded the city, creating a picturesque scene. The bustling city greeted them with the cheerful chatter of fellow trainers, shopkeepers, and the occasional Pokemon cry. Entering Cerulean, the streets unfolded with a variety of shops, each offering a different allure for trainers and travelers alike. Pokemon centers hummed with activity as trainers tended to their partners, and shops displayed an array of items from potions to Pokeballs. Midori guided Violet through the lively city, sharing stories of his own past adventures. The air was filled with excitement as they neared the iconic Cerulean Gym, where Midori expected to find the gym leader. Misty, a skilled water-type trainer, greeted them with a friendly smile. Midori's eyes widened momentarily, betraying a hint of surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "Misty, this is my daughter, Violet," Midori introduced, exchanging pleasantries. After the introductions, they proceeded to the gym's interior, where Misty led them to a large pool surrounded by lush greenery. Staryu gracefully twirled, Horsey darted playfully, and Poliwag exhibited its playful hops in the water. Misty shared insights about each Pokemon, describing their personalities.
Staryu is swift and agile. Horsey is curious and spirited, while Poliwag is friendly and full of energy.
Violet's eyes sparkled with excitement as she listened, captivated by the prospect of choosing her first Pokemon. Misty turned to her, a gleam of anticipation in her eyes.
Violet, the time has come. Which Pokemon will be your companion on this grand adventure?
And with that, the decision rested in the hands of a 10-year-old, setting the stage for the next chapter of their Pokemon journey. Chapter 3. Hi-Ho Horsey.
I choose Horsey.
Violet's eyes gleamed with excitement as she declared her choice for the spirited water-type Pokemon. Misty handed her a chain with a colorful scale dangling from it.
Horsey was carrying this in its mouth when I rescued it,
Misty explained. Violet fastened the chain around her neck, the scale acting as a pendant and the symbol of her newfound partnership with Horsey. You'll want to think of a name for your new friend, Midori suggested. He smiled at Violet as he watched her hug her new Pokemon close.
So, Violet,
Misty started.
do you know which gym you might want to face first?
Violet looked up with uncertainty.
Well, not yours, probably. I think I might need to get some experience before I fight any gym. And, well, my one water Pokemon won't be able to do much to your water Pokemon.
Nodding, Misty said,
That's pretty smart, Violet. You keep thinking like that and you'll be a great trainer in no time.
We have a couple of options, Midori chimed in. If we head south, we could hit Saffron and face the Psychic Gym.
Actually, that way is blocked right now. The guards aren't letting anyone in. But you could take the underground path to Cerulean City,
Offered Misty. Midori frowned. Isn't that Lieutenant Surge's gym?
Yes, but Diglett Cave is near there. You could try catching one of them before facing his electric Pokemon. Otherwise, going east will take you on a long route before you see any gyms. That would give plenty of time for you and Horsey to get stronger and form a better bond before it is really put to the test. Plus, the Horsey will have some advantage through the rock tunnel.
True, Midori agreed. But it is pretty dark in there. And, if you want to face a gym a little sooner than that, Violet, we could always go to Pewter City. They use rock Pokemon in that gym, which Horsey will be able to handle, and the path through Mount Moon would be a great place to help your Horsey prepare. Overwhelmed with options, Violet ultimately decided that heading through Mount Moon into Pewter City was the best course of action. After leaving Cerulean Gym, the father and daughter stopped at a Pokemart and picked up some Pokeballs before heading off toward the mountain and its winding caves. As the pair reached Mount Moon, the looming cave entrance evoked a sense of mystery and anticipation. Violet's heart raced with excitement, and Horsey, resting on her partner's shoulder, seemed ready for the challenges ahead. The cave's interior was dimly lit. It was known there were moonstones scattered around in those caves, and they gave off a soft glow. It was handy to not have to rely on torches to get through. Violet navigated through the cavern, echoes of distant Pokemon cries promising potential encounters ahead. A Zubat swooped overhead with a screech and flew off into the darker reaches of the cavern. V made a curious sound and looked around, keeping an eye out for anything else that might drop down from above. With his eyes up in the air, V ran right into a boulder and cried out as he bounced back onto his butt. But then the boulder moved, and the sound of grinding stone echoed out as the rock turned in place, and two eyes appeared upon it. A Geodude! Violet, get ready! The girl twirled around in excitement and reached for Horsey's Pokeball before remembering the creature was on her shoulder. She fumbled around, dropped the Pokeball, and waved over at the rock Pokemon.
Go, Horsey, go!
The little water Pokemon narrowed its eyes with excited determination and launched forward, ready to engage in its first battle for Violet.
Use Bubble, Horsey!
The Geodude tried to roll out of the way as a stream of bubbles shot toward him, but he wasn't quick enough and was hit hard. The water softened him up a great deal, and he fled in defeat. Way to go, Violet. That was some quick... But before Midori can finish, the entire cave rumbled violently, and large chunks of rock fell from the ceiling. A Pokemon screeched out, and it sounded in pain. Chapter 4. Pinned in Mount Moon.
What was that?
Violet shouted. I don't know, but I think a Pokemon got hit. Come on! The pair gathered their Pokemon and rushed off to see what happened, and they discovered a Zubat with a wing pinned underneath a large piece of rock that fell. It screeched as it struggled to free itself, flapping its free wing violently. The sound of its cry was painful and made it hard to think. Even the Eevee and Horsey seemed to get all turned around by the racket. Midori reached under the rock as best he could, while also shielding himself from the wild flapping of the Zubat. Violet, help me lift this up! The girl wasted no time in rushing over to help, and together they just barely managed to lift the rock far enough for the Zubat to get free. As soon as its wing was out, the Zubat flew away as fast as it could.
You could say thank you,
Violet called out after it. Midori chuckled and stood up, dusting off his hands and jeans. I wonder what caused all this to fall. You stay here a minute. I'm going to look around back there and see what I can find. He climbed up over some other rocks and vanished behind the large chunk that had fallen on the Zubat. Violet looked down at V and Horsey.
You two okay?
They both cried out in an affirmative-sounding response.
Good.
Well, what do we have here? Two men in identical black uniforms stepped out from around a corner. Each uniform had a large letter R prominently featured. Looks like a fresh new Pokemon trainer, the second man said. And foolishly traveling all alone with so much danger all around. V's hair bristled as it lowered its head and glared at the two men. Horsey's eyes narrowed again, and the Pokemon almost seemed ready to rush in and attack at a moment's notice. That doesn't seem wise, little girl, said the man who had been the first to speak. He had a thin scar across his left cheek. I think we better take those two Pokemon and put them into the hands of someone who could do better protecting them. Violet stepped forward and put herself between V and the men.
I won't let you do that.
The two men stopped in place and slowly looked at one another. Then they burst out laughing. I don't think you have a choice, replied the second man. Then he pulled out a Pokeball and aimed it at the girl. Violet flinched back, not sure what to expect. Then, just before it happened, she remembered something important. She had forgotten to pick up Horsey's Pokeball when her and Midori had run off. The dirt and scuff marks on the Pokeball in the second man's hand suggested that he was holding Horsey's Pokeball. And when a beam of light shot out and consumed Horsey, sucking the water Pokemon inside, she knew for certain that it was.
No! Give him back!
Violet rushed forward to reclaim her Pokemon, but the man with the scar stepped forward and planted a solid kick to the girl's stomach. The wind rushed out from her lungs, and she stumbled back in shock and collapsed to her knees. The two men started to laugh again until they saw V rushing forward, letting out a battle cry as it leapt through the air at Mr. Scar. Seeing the pale-furred Eevee flying toward his face, the man flailed back and accidentally hit Horsey's Pokeball out of his partner's hand. Get it away from me! The man cried in a panic. His partner, confused at the sudden chaos, turned and found the Eevee on his buddy's chest, nipping at the man's face. Hey, what kind of Pokemon is that? Who cares? Just get it off me! Right. And the man sent a swift kick at V, knocking the poor Pokemon across the cave and into a rock wall. While that was going on, Violet crawled over to retrieve her Pokeball with Horsey in it, but as her hand clasped around the orb, a foot pressed down on her hand, keeping it there. This one is ours now, little girl. Mr. Scar bent down to pick up the Pokeball, only to be met by a handful of dirt being flung into his eyes. He reeled back, crying out in pain and frustration. Violet used the same hand she had used to throw the dirt to push the second man's foot off her other hand. She stood up with the Pokeball and was prepared to run when she was grabbed by the second man. He started to pick her up, but then his partner, with the dirt in his face, wheeled around and ran into the man holding Violet. She dropped to the ground. The Pokeball popped out of her hand and rolled away. She scrambled after it as fast as she could, and then she tackled the Pokeball, just as it went over a cliff. A scream echoed sharply through the cave as she dropped into the darkness. Then suddenly she stopped short as her jacket snagged on some jagged piece of rock halfway down the cliff, leaving her hanging helplessly in the void, and V unconscious near the two thugs that tried to rob her. Chapter 5. Going Batty. Midori was using his old, battered Pokedex to illuminate the area behind the fallen chunks of ceiling, looking to see if there was any sign of what caused the incident, or if there were any more injured Pokemon. As he wandered deeper in, he heard Violet talking to V and her Horsey. Nearby what must have once been a solid wall, Midori found a rough hole. He figured that whatever created the hole was likely what brought the ceiling down, but before he could investigate any further, a sharp scream pierced through the darkness. Midori immediately knew it was Violet, and rushed back through the rocks and back out into where he had left her and the two Pokemon. They weren't there anymore. Midori saw two figures in dark clothing fleeing the scene, but he ignored them as he scanned the area for his daughter. "Violet!"
I'm down here.
Honing in on her voice, Midori rushed to the edge of the cliff and looked down to see Violet in a very precarious position. It seemed that a sharp piece of rock had pierced the girl's coat as she fell and was now holding her there, just out of reach. Hearing him arrive, Violet looked up to see Midori at the top of the cliff, but her movement caused the coat to tear a bit more and she dropped another inch. "Hold on, Violet. Don't move, Midori looked around, hoping to find anything useful. "I'll find something to help." Then he was gone, and Violet was alone and helpless, holding tightly to Horsey's Pokeball. Up above, Midori was at a complete loss. The only thing he could think of was to call for V, and so he gave a sharp whistle. Normally, the pale-furred Eevee would rush forward instantly at that call, and, if farther away, let out a cry in acknowledgement. When neither happened, Midori felt his stomach drop out. He was astonished at how their journey had fallen apart so quickly. "Am I cursed? This is just as bad as last time." Panic started to set in as his mind replayed memories from when he had last been in Mount Moon, and he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to rescue Violet just like he had failed the Clefairy years ago. Midori ran a hand through his hair and gave another shot at the whistle. Unlike before, he was met with a response, only it didn't relieve him, as it was not the response he anticipated. "Ow! What the— Ah!" There was another scream, but it wasn't Violet this time. Instead, it had come from a man. "I'll get him!" shouted a voice out from the darkness. "That little beast tried to eat me!" Then Midori recognized the cry of V and thought he heard the echoing patter of furry feet coming closer. But there were other, heavier footsteps, and the shouts of the two men seemed to draw close behind. Midori rushed forward and could finally see his Pokemon and his two pursuers, two men with big letter R's on their uniforms. Midori wasn't going to be able to reach V before they did. Still, he wasn't going to give up and prepared himself to get into a brawl. Suddenly, adding to the cacophony of sounds echoing throughout the caves, there was a third scream. Unlike the other two, this one wasn't human. The two men suddenly stopped chasing the Eevee as a Golbat swooped down, straight at them. They tumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the attack. Scrambling to their feet, they tripped over one another several times and accidentally stepped on each other's fingers. Eventually, they were up and managed to both face the same direction. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, they fled down deeper into the cave, away from Midori, V, and the swooping Golbat. Midori offered the bat a salute and said, "Thanks, friend. You really came in the nick of—" Another sudden scream erupted from Violet as her jacket tore a little more, reminding Midori that there were other, more pressing matters to attend to than thanking a Golbat. "V, come on!" Rushing back to where Violet was about to fall to her doom, Midori dropped to his knees and slid to a stop at the edge of the cliff. He flattened himself to the ground and stretched as far as he could, but still couldn't reach the girl. He growled through gritted teeth and whipped around to V. "Did you see any rope or a long stick or anything?" The Eevee shook its head. Then the Pokemon ducked as something swooped over it. V was almost hit as something swooped by again, and after the third one, the little Eevee simply got down as low as it could to avoid the rest of the Zubats that were coming through. Each one dove over the cliff and swarmed over Violet. She screamed and dropped Horsey's Pokeball as she tried to protect herself. All the movement proved too much for the integrity of her jacket, and it tore through the rest of the way, sending Violet screaming into the depths. "Violet! No!" However, Violet's scream didn't grow more distant, and, instead, became louder as it drew closer. The swarm of Zubats were flapping and screeching their way back to the top of the cliff, over Midori's head, and then gathered just to the other side of him. When they finally dispersed to land a few feet away, there was a girl standing on the ground in complete surprise. "Violet!" Midori rushed over and held the girl tight. After a minute, the shock began to wear off, and she hugged her father back. They looked back over to the Zubats that had rescued Violet and found the Golbat landing in front of the other Pokemon and dropped a scuffed-up Pokeball at its feet.
Is that Horsey?"
The Golbat lifted its wings as if to shrug and then nudged the ball, making it roll forward a few inches toward Violet. Midori was astonished at the sudden turn of events. What's going on? I mean, thank you. Thank you for saving my daughter. The Golbat flapped a wing, and the swarm of Zubat drifted apart, revealing the smallest of the Zubats lurking in the back of the crowd. One of its wings looked a little funny, and Violet suddenly realized what must have happened.
That's the one we helped get out from under the rock.
Midori's eyes widened. Is that your child? The Golbat nodded. For a moment, no person or Pokemon moved. They all simply looked at one another with gratitude and how they had all helped one another out. Then the Golbat cried out and flapped its wings, and it seemed to be a signal to the rest. All the other Zubats moved around the littlest one, and each gave a wing flap, some of them hitting the poor thing right in the face. But it didn't seem upset or hurt by the interactions, and to Midori, it looked as if they were performing some kind of ritual. Then the little one and the Golbat looked at one another. The Golbat flapped twice and screeched, and then it pointed a wing at Midori. The little one took a few steps forward, and the rest of the Zubats moved back further. The little Zubat looked up at Midori and held up its wings as if waiting for something. When Midori didn't do anything, the Golbat let out a screech, flapped its wings, and tapped the Pokeball in front of it.
I think it wants you to catch it,
Violet suggested. Midori looked back and forth between the little Zubat and the Golbat, more surprised than ever. Are you sure? The Golbat nodded again. Midori returned the nod to show he understood the importance of the interaction and was taking it seriously. He pulled out one of the Pokeballs they had just bought before leaving Cerulean City, tossed it toward the little Zubat. The ball hit the ground, popped open, and the Zubat was consumed by the light inside before vanishing completely. The ball shut, dinged once, and then clicked. With a last, parting look, the Golbat and the rest of the Zubat swarm took off back into the cave, leaving Violet's horsey Pokeball behind for her to collect. Chapter 6. A Battle with Perez. After the Golbat and Zubats left, Midori and Violet gathered their stuff and started back on the path that would hopefully take them out the opposite side of Mount Moon. They walked in silence for a few minutes, attempting to process all that just happened, Midori often looking at the Pokeball that now housed the little Zubat.
That was pretty crazy with the Zubats picking me up and everything. I guess that little Zubat did say thank you after all.
I'd say. I can hardly believe any of that even happened. I keep checking the Pokeball just to prove that it did.
And who were those two jerks?
Midori stopped a moment. He had forgotten all about the idiots that had rushed off after Golbat swooped at them. Two jerks? The ones with the R on their uniforms?
Yeah, them. I mean, they must be part of some gang or something, yeah?
Yeah, they are. They were members of Team Rocket.
Team Rocket? Weird name.
Midori smirked. Yeah, I guess it is. I know those two idiots stumbled all over themselves, but, well, the gang is pretty bad news in general. I've heard they are well organized. They see Pokemon as tools to be used for money and power. They don't seem to care who gets hurt. Violet looked over at her father, concerned.
Sounds like you've run into them before.
Yeah, you could say that. Midori looked troubled, and Violet was about to ask him more, but then Midori pointed ahead. Hey, look! There's a trainer over there. Good opportunity to get some practice in. Sure enough, they reached a larger area of the cave, and there was a kid, probably about 10 years old, battling a Paris. Squirtle, use Bubble! A Squirtle rushed by the Paris and sent a barrage of bubbles at the other Pokemon. It didn't seem to do much, and the Paris chased after the Squirtle and scratched at it. Midori leaned over to whisper to Violet. That was a mistake. You know how I mentioned the cave would be a good place to train your horsey?
Yeah?
Well, that's because your water Pokemon can take on Geodudes pretty easy, and Zubats and Clefairy are neutral, but that Pokemon there is a bit more of a challenge.
Because it's a grass-type Pokemon. Yeah, I know.
Midori looked at his daughter, incredulous.
What? You know I've been studying Pokemon for a while now.
Ah, yes. Well, I suppose you have. Violet could tell her dad was a little disappointed not to be able to pass on some knowledge in that moment, so she offered him an alternative target.
You know, it seems that he might have missed that fact, though. Maybe you could help him out?
Midori frowned in thought, then decided that maybe he could do that. Hey, kid, that Paris is resistant to water. You might want to try a different move, or a different Pokemon even. The kid looked back. Resistant to water? Bug isn't resistant to water. Yeah, that's true, but Paris is also grass. That seemed to get to the kid. He froze for a moment and then smacked his head. Right! Duh! Meanwhile, the Squirtle just had a blast of powder sprayed into its face. He swayed on his feet and then landed backward onto his shell and began to snooze away. Ah, not stun spore! Squirtle, return! The youngster held out his Pokeball, and a beam of light shot out and gathered the Squirtle just in the nick of time as Paris slashed a claw through the air. All right, you little bug. I'm gonna get you now. Pidgey, I choose you! With that, the bird Pokemon flew onto the scene. It weaved and dodged and blew sand into the face of the Paris before swooping in and quickly knocking the bug Pokemon around. Then, as it seemed to be getting tired, the boy threw a Pokeball at the Paris, and after a couple of pings, there was a click as the Pokeball sealed. Yes! The youngster jumped in the air. I caught myself a Paris! Way to go, kid, Midori said. Now, do you think you're up for a trainer battle? The kid looked up at Midori, and his face paled slightly. Against you? Midori grinned and then shook his head. No.
He means me.
Violet stepped forward with a determined expression matched by the horsey that had returned to being perched on her shoulder. Oh, the kid rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know. My Pokemon are a little beat up. Violet raised an eyebrow.
What? Are you scared?
That worked. The boy immediately straightened his back and clenched his fist in front of him. Not at all! He grabbed one of his Pokeballs and got ready to release the Pokemon inside. I'm not going to hold back just because you're a girl, so you better be ready. Violet frowned at that. She didn't want him to hold back, but she didn't like that he felt the need to say that because it somehow implied that girls were just not as good at battling. Then she smirked a little, thinking he might need to change that attitude before making it to Cerulean City. Otherwise, he might get himself into hot water with Misty. Hey, why don't we make this a fair battle? Midori stepped in between the pair. You have any Pokemon not beat up, kid? No, they've all been battling through Mount Moon. All right, no problem. I have a few potions. We'll patch up one of your Pokemon, and then you can each use one Pokemon for the battle. Sound fair? The kid looked thoughtful and then nodded. Yeah, okay. Let's do it. When everything was settled, it was time for the match to begin. It was clear that Violet would be using Horsey, as it was all she had so far. But Violet wondered what the kid might have. It was likely he had some wild Pokemon already, seeing as he already carried at least a Pidgey and a Squirtle. Midori, having given the potions, knew exactly what Pokemon the kid would use. A part of him was relieved, but he was still a bit nervous for his daughter. Horsey had hardly any experience so far, so it could be a rough go. All right, ready? The youngster and Violet got into position and stared each other down, both brimming with confidence. Then battle! The youngster threw a Pokeball into the air and it popped open. Go, Nido! Appearing in the cave was a male Nidoran. Violet breathed a sigh of relief. She had hoped the kid wouldn't go with Paris or some other grass Pokemon.
I choose you.
Part 7. Violet's first match, or Horsey gets a name. The Horsey perched upon Violet's shoulder leapt down to confront her opponent's purple Nidoran. The two Pokemon stared at one another as they awaited the commands from their trainers. Then, at the exact same time, both Violet and the boy shouted, Nido! Use Leer! Bubbles issued from out of Horsey and sailed toward the Nidoran. The eyes of the purple Pokemon stared out at Horsey, and they were magnified and warped by the bubbles floating toward him. This seemed to shake the water Pokemon, but the bubbly water also ended up snapping in the Nidoran's eyes. They winced from its stinging.
Watch out, Mizu. I think he's going to charge at you.
Sure enough, the young boy points at the Horsey and tells his Nidoran to tackle. Despite Violet's warning, her Pokemon doesn't respond right away, shaken from the Leer effect of Nidoran, and is unable to defend itself as well as it had meant to. Horsey is knocked back hard, but not as hard as it could have been, as Nidoran didn't quite make a straight shot. It seemed Horsey's bubble had been quite critical in that moment, as the Nidoran's eyes were still stinging and blurry from the attack. Both Pokemon already looked a bit battered and weary, neither of them too used to fighting yet. Midori watched intensely at the battle taking place, able to see that each Pokemon could probably take about one more hit, and that Nidoran was fast and knew more moves than little Mizu. It wasn't looking great, but Midori did take comfort that it wasn't over super quickly, and it wouldn't be a humiliating defeat for either of them, as they both got their licks in. Violet could see that things were looking pretty grim for Mizu, and she stood a really good chance of losing. For just a brief moment she even thought to try and play helpless beginner girl and trick the boy into going easy on her, or at least get his guard down. But she didn't want to encourage his attitude, nor did she want to win in such a cheap way. If she was going to win, she would do it right. And if she lost, well, that would just be the way it was. This was her first real battle after all. Who could blame her?
All right, this is it, Mizu. Let's give it our best shot. Bubble!
And just as the horsey sent another barrage of bubbles, the boy cried out his last command that seemed foolish to Violet. He told Nidoran to use Leer again, which did shake the water Pokemon some, but it didn't matter, as that last shot of bubble was all that was needed to finish off the Nidoran. Oh, man! The boy reached his Pokeball out, and a beam of light shot off and collected the Nidoran back into the Pokeball where it can rest. Not daring to celebrate until she was certain her opponent was defeated, Violet jumped into the air once the Nidoran was returned.
Yes, I did it!
She looked over to the youngster and put a hand on her hip.
Well, how was it being beaten by a girl?
Violet! The boom of Midori's voice echoed through the caves of Mount Moon, and there were the sounds of shifting rock, skittering feet, and screeches coming back in response, startled or angered by the sound. The girl turned and looked at her father's stern face and knew instantly that she must have done something wrong in his eyes. She didn't speak, waiting to hear what he had to say. The young boy also was staring at the man, shaken by the sudden shout himself. Midori opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again when he noticed that the boy was also watching him. Instead, he breathed in deep to give himself time to think how best to handle the situation without embarrassing anyone. He cleared his throat and then stepped forward, collecting Horsey and administering a potion to it as he brought the Pokemon back to Violet. You did well, Violet. Midori looked up toward the boy and said, You both did. And you will do even greater if you both learn something from this experience. But if you didn't, let me give you this little sliver of wisdom I was told years ago. Your ability as a trainer is only a piece of the puzzle on whether you win or lose. Many things can happen in a match, and you never win or lose on your own. Midori looked back and forth between the boy and Violet, watching to see if any of what he had said sunk in. He knew Violet well enough to know she was at least mulling it over, if not coming to some understanding. But the boy was anybody's guess. He just stood there staring, and Midori wondered for a moment if the kid hadn't maybe fallen asleep with his eyes open. All right, congratulate one another and then we can all move on, Midori said, waving a hand back and forth to each of them. The pair looked at one another, uncertain on what to do exactly and not really sure they wanted to do whatever it was. Violet had scrunched up her face as if she thought the boy smelled like a muck, and the boy had a bruised ego from being beaten. But instead of just ignoring Midori completely and going their own way, they were stuck. At one level or another, they both seemed to fear Midori. The man sighed, realizing they both had a lot to learn in sportsmanship, and he realized that their isolated living had not really given Violet practice in that area. Oh, come on! We don't want to spend the rest of our lives in this cave, do we? When it seemed like Violet was about to answer that she might actually want to do that if it meant not having to congratulate her opponent, Midori quickly answered his own question. We don't. Trust me, the mischievous Clefairy alone are enough of a reason not to linger. Violet struggled, knowing she was going to have to go through with it, but really resisting. So Midori took his foot and swung it right into Violet's butt, pushing her forward and forcing her to make the first move. The two got just close enough to shake if each of their arms were stretched out straight in front of them.
Good match,
Violet grumbled, and the boy said the same. Then they both reached out and shook once, as quickly as possible, and then retreated from one another. Midori rolled his eyes. Well, that'll have to do for now. He looked over at the youngster. Hey kid, be careful through here, all right? There was a cave-in earlier and some shady people roaming around. You see anyone with an R on some kind of uniform, you stay away from them. Oh, and you just might want to change your attitude about girl trainers before you reach Cerulean City. There's a reason Misty is a gym leader, all right? The boy was startled at that revelation, and then he nodded quickly before rushing off further into Mount Moon. All right, we should get moving too, Violet.
Fine.
Violet had her arms crossed and kicked at a small rock in the ground as she started to trudge along after her father. She wasn't particularly pleased with him at that moment. Midori sighed again. It was going to be a long trek out of the mountain. Part 8. The Glowing Rock. Except for the echo of footsteps, there was no sound as Midori and Violet continued their walk through the mountain caves for the next 5 minutes. Sensing the tension, there wasn't even a peep from the accompanying Evie and Horsey. Midori took a deep breath, and Violet tensed up, sure her father was going to lecture her some more. "Look, Violet, I know you're not used to battling yet, and it's kind of my fault you don't know how to win or lose properly."
Win properly? I won, didn't I? And I didn't cheat, so how is that not properly?
Midori stopped and turned to look at Violet. She kept walking, however, and so Midori started back up as he talked. "You were not being kind in victory. You gloated, and, in doing that, were taking all the credit for the win. Did you even consider that you might have just gotten lucky?" Whirling around, Violet glared at Midori.
You think I just got lucky? Real nice. So you don't even give me any credit? I might as well not even be a trainer then, huh? If all I have is luck.
Whoa, Midori said, putting his hands up. "I did not say you were lucky. I just said you didn't even consider the possibility that some luck was involved. I know you know a lot, and there was skill at play, but it doesn't mean it's all skill."
But you said I just got lucky, and...
"I did not. I suggested the possibility. Don't twist my words to mean something else. And while you throw a tantrum about me taking credit away from you, what about Mizu?" Violet furrowed her brow.
Mizu? What about Mizu?
"You started gloating and forgot all about your Horsey. You just left Mizu sitting out there having won the battle against the Nidoran and didn't congratulate it or share in the glory or even call it back to you. Is that the relationship you want with your Pokemon?" Crossing her arms, Violet didn't say a word. But in her defiant scowl she was turning to Midori, there was a hint of remorse as her eyes took a quick dart to the side to glance at Mizu, perched there on the girl's shoulder. Midori shrugged. "I mean, if that is what you want, keep at it. But don't be surprised when you find yourself losing your battles." Midori started walking again, moving beyond Violet, who stood there facing where Midori had been a little longer before finally turning and following along again. As the pair continued along with their Pokemon companions, Midori occasionally stole a glance behind him and noticed that Violet had listened to him and seemed to be reconciling with her Horsey. She clearly had a bit of pride keeping her from admitting Midori had a point, but he couldn't fault her for that too much, since he had issues with pride himself. It was good enough for him to see she had not shut out everything he had said. It took another few minutes before anything else was said, and when words were spoken it had nothing to do with the earlier conversation. "Violet, look at this!" Midori said as he rushed over to what looked like just any of the other cave walls they had passed. His eyes were wide with excitement as he ran his hands over the surface, and something glinted between his fingers. Curiosity propelled the girl forward, and she tried to figure out what light was even being reflected in whatever her father had found. Midori waved his arm rapidly to try and hurry Violet along. Then, as she drew closer, he motioned to a small stone wedged into the cave wall, and it was giving off a pale glow.
Is that a moonstone?
Violet asked, amazed. "Yep. These stones are what give us so much light in the Mount Moon caves. Also, what gives the mountain its name."
I know that's where the name comes from, Dad,
Violet said, rolling her eyes. "Right, of course." Midori flashed a sheepish grin. "Anyway, despite them lighting up the caves, they can be hard to find, and, like this one, even when found, they can be next to impossible to collect." Midori looked around for a minute, apparently hoping to find something. Then he said, "If only we had a pickaxe." He shrugged. "Ah, well, better luck next time, I guess." Violet leaned in closer and peered at the rock.
Is it true that the Clefairy are responsible for bringing these stones here?
"That's certainly a legend I've heard. Some claim it's one of their abilities that shower the mountain in moonstones, while others have suggested that the Clefairy are actually from the moon and they bring pieces of it with them when they come down here."
Or maybe...
Violet frowned in thought.
Maybe they have nothing to do with them at all, and they are just attracted to the moonstones, and that's why Clefairy are most often found in Mount Moon.
"Certainly possible," Midori agreed. "Whatever the case may be, if there is a moonstone here, then there is likely Clefairy or more not far. Be on the lookout. Those Pokemon can be very mischievous, but would be a great catch if you—"
Dad, duck!
Midori dropped his head down quickly, and as soon as he did, a pink, roundish creature bounded over him, giving off its sweet cry.
Was that a Clefairy?
Midori looked in the direction the Pokemon was bouncing off to, and then back at his daughter. I think so. Want to chase after it? Violet grinned and pulled out a Pokeball.
I want to catch it.
Part 9. Trouble Clefairy. Midori and Violet were running down through dark tunnels, trying to catch up to the bounding pink Pokemon that had nearly collided with Midori's head a few moments earlier. Mizu, the horsey, was wide-eyed as it clung to Violet's shoulder while the pale Eevee was rushing along just a few steps behind Midori. Violet stopped for a second, hands on her knees, panting.
Did we lose it?
Breathing hard, Midori ran by her. No, I can still see a faint glow. The girl looked as if she was about to say something, but then just nodded her head instead. She took a deep breath, pushed off her knees, and started running again. We're gaining on it. We just need to... Whoa! Oh! Midori vanished from Violet's view, and V, the Eevee, made a complete stop and cried out for Midori. Violet skidded to a halt along the path, and it turned out to be just in time as her toes hung over the edge of a cliff.
Dad?
Violet called out in a sudden panic.
Dad!
She searched hard for any sign of Midori, but found she couldn't even see the bottom of the cliff. She opened her mouth to call out again, but then there was the sound of splashing that was quickly followed by multiple Clefairy cries as about 3 little points of light came from different directions and descended down toward the splashing at the bottom of the cliff. The notes of the 3 creatures blended together into something resembling a song played on a music box. Violet? Midori's voice echoed upward to the girl, sending a wave of relief through her. Violet, are you... Hey, knock that off. Quit pulling on my ear, you... There was more wild splashing as it sounded like Midori was having a conflict with the 3 Pokemon.
I'm up here, Dad. Are you okay?
Ow, knock that off! There was a slap, and the notes of the Clefairy melody were interrupted as one let out a sharp yelp. Yeah, I'm okay. If these blasted Clefairy would stop poking and prodding me, I'd be a lot better, though. There was a little more splashing and Clefairy chirps. That's right, I'm talking about you, you pink punk! A moment of no sound followed, and then... Oh no. There was a lot of splashing and thrashing and angry Clefairy noises that sounded like the same music box song as before, but played way too fast. V pricked up its ears and cried out down toward Midori. Then, with a look of determination, V leapt off the cliff and sailed down toward the bottom to fight off the Clefairy. One of the Clefairy clearly got hit by the plummeting Pokemon. Taking the opportunity V's surprise attack gave him, Midori shouted up toward Violet. Try to lure one of the Clefairy up there to you. This might be your best chance of catching one.
But what about you? It sounds like they're drowning you down there.
Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I'm well protected. There was a flash of light, and Midori shouted, You're up, Luckwing! The screech of a Zubat pierced through the dark.
Right. He has 2 Pokemon with him now, so it's 3 versus 3.
Violet thought to herself.
And if I can lure one up, then he has the advantage down there. But how do I get one to come up here? I doubt taunting it will do anything.
Then Violet felt Mizu shift around on her shoulder. She slowly turned her head to look at the horsey as it slowly turned to look at her, and their eyes met. Violet smirked, and Mizu looked like it could have been smirking on the inside.
Mizu? Bubble.
The horsey sprayed bubbles down the cliff, and Violet heard some snap as they collided with something. She hoped it was one of the Clefairy and not Midori or either of his Pokemon. It didn't take long to find out as one of the faint glows down below started coming closer. It shot up toward Violet with a very mischievous smile. The girl jumped away and landed on her side hard.
Ow!
Mizu had jumped off the girl's shoulder at the last moment and shot another bubble attack at the Clefairy.
Mizu, dodge!
The horsey darted to one side as the Clefairy tried to strike again. Then, apparently frustrated by its own failure to connect with Violet and her Pokemon, the Clefairy turned and stared at the two and started ticking its hands back and forth. It started slow at first, but as it picked up speed, the pink Pokemon began to glow.
What are you? Oh no. That must be Metrodome!
The Clefairy grinned widely, and it made the normally cute creature look almost demonic.
Mizu, quick, hit it with...
But it was too late. The Clefairy was already glowing so bright. It let out one small musical cry which indicated that whatever move Metronome was going to conjure was happening in that moment. And then the Pokemon was gone, and suddenly reappeared on the opposite side of Mizu. The Clefairy had teleported. It took that opportunity to swing at the horsey and clobbered Mizu in the head. Mizu returned fire with another bubble attack, and not wanting to take a chance that the Clefairy would flee or use metronome again, Violet grabbed a Pokeball and tossed it at the creature. The Pokeball smacked the Clefairy right in the kisser and popped open. A different kind of light enveloped the Pokemon, and it performed its second disappearing act, right into the Pokeball. The red and white sphere snapped shut, and the little indicator light blinked red. The ball wiggled. The light blinked red again, and there was another wiggle from the Pokeball.
Come on, come on!
Part 10. Flower Child. Drip, drip, drip. A small pool of water formed beneath a stalactite in the dark cavern. The sound of the drops above splashing into the little pool below echoed off the walls and were only accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing coming from just a few feet away. There, slumped against a wall, was a girl with dark pink hair. On the ground, beneath one limp hand, was a small chisel of sorts. In her other hand, on the verge of rolling out of it, was something that resembled a Pokeball, but made out of an acorn or something. The girl's eyes were closed as she snoozed away, and a few other wheezes and snores joined her own rhythmic breaths. They came from 3 separate Pokemon all gathered around the girl. One was resting on her lap, colored black and red, its polka-dotted wings folded in. Pressing into her back was a stout creature with a shiny bluish-blackish back with red dots, and then, at the girl's feet and stretching its little roots towards the puddle of water, was a flower-like Pokemon with a yellow, bell-shaped head. The root-like feet stirred as the sound of feet scraping rapidly against rocky ground echoed through the tunnel. The Pokemon lifted its yellow head and blinked sleepily, slightly confused over where it was or why it was awake. Then distant voices traveled toward it.
We're gaining. We just need to... Whoa!
There was a moment of silence, and then the sound of something plunging into water came through just above the girl and her 3 Pokemon. The grass Pokemon's eyes went wide, and it ducked as if it thought something was about to crash on top of its thin frame. A few pebbles did drop from the ceiling, and the dripping water halted for a moment. When it resumed, the creature thought it sounded a little different, almost faster.
Dad?
The Pokemon was not going to be able to go back to sleep after all that, and all the commotion was making it nervous.
Violet?
It seemed possible its companions and trainer were all in danger, and so, reluctantly, the creature moved back to the girl and prodded her with its foot.
Violet,
There was no reaction. Lowering its yellow head and sighing, the Pokemon gave another kick. The girl scrunched up her face and scratched at her leg where she had been kicked. The Pokemon frowned, backed up a step, and then stretched out a vine and whipped it against the trainer's leg.
Ow!
The girl shot up, which caused the red and black Pokemon to fly up and spread its bug-like wings to stay aloft rather than drop to the ground, and the other Pokemon tumbled back and blasted flames through its red spots in shock.
What the heck? Why did you...
She stopped, as a lot of splashing and thrashing was heard from beyond the rocky ceiling above. The girl and all the Pokemon looked up with uncertainty. Then there was a cracking sound, and a larger piece of rock fell from the ceiling and splashed into the little puddle. The dripping turned into a trickling of water.
Oh no.
Cracks started to grow around the stalactite, and didn't look like they were stopping anytime soon.
I think we should probably get moving.
The flower-like Pokemon rolled its whole head instead of just its eyes, while the other 2 Pokemon nodded in agreement with the girl. There was some more cracking up above, and they all started running up the tunnel, except for the black and red bug that flew instead. The flower-like Pokemon wasn't fast, and so the girl scooped it up in her arms as they continued to hurry. It became clear to the girl pretty early on that the tunnel was at an incline, and she was having more and more trouble breathing as she and her Pokemon moved as quickly as they could, running up that hill. Finally, they entered into a large open chamber, and she collapsed to the ground, barely bringing the Pokemon she was carrying to the ground before releasing it. She looked back toward the tunnel to see if it was starting to flood yet, and if they were in any immediate danger. Taking deep breaths, the girl looked over at her Pokemon next, seeing nothing coming up the tunnel after them.
I think we made it, guys.
There was no sound of rushing water or anything from that tunnel. The neighboring path, however, there it sounded like a fight was taking place. No, not a fight. A Pokemon battle!
Mizu, dodge!
Wow, Mount Moon is active today.
The girl picked herself up off the ground and started to brush the rock and dirt off her knees and legs.
We should get out of here before we get caught up in any unnecessary battles. I just want those badges.
She started to walk in the opposite direction of the noise, her bug Pokemon flying over her shoulder and the fire Pokemon walking along by her feet. But the grass Pokemon stayed behind. It looked at the tunnel with the noise, at the girl, then the tunnel they had just run from, back to the girl, and then it cried out. The girl turned around and looked.
What? I don't want to battle any other trainers. That's not why I'm here.
Oh, no.
Looking pointedly back at the tunnels, the Pokemon cried out again and then stared at the girl. She shrugged.
I don't know what you're trying to tell me. Can we just go, please?
Quick,
The Pokemon narrowed its eyes and continued staring for a little longer. Then it took a deep breath, shook its yellow head, and turned around. As soon as it did, the girl knew what was about to happen, and she rushed forward to stop her Pokemon, but she was too late. It started sprinting down the tunnel where the battle was taking place, and the girl landed hard on the ground.
Ow! That wasn't fun.
She grumbled to herself. Then she popped up and said,
I'm okay.
And then she rubbed at her banged-up knees, wincing in pain. She stood up straight and jerked her head toward the tunnel the Pokemon had escaped down.
All right, come on, you two.
Both the bug and fire Pokemon came over toward her, and they all faced the tunnel together.
I really need to start keeping her in a Pokeball.
Part 11. Pool Party. A pale Eevee shot through a large pool of dark water in a large cavern. A pink, round Pokemon with little glowing wings dove after the Eevee, and missed. The Clefairy created a large splash where it hit the water instead. Up above, a Zubat zigzagged through the air as another of the Clefairy chased after it. In the center of all the commotion, a man treaded water and shouted out commands to his two Pokemon. The Eevee scrambled atop the man's head, dripping water all over him, and bounded off right toward the Clefairy that was chasing the Zubat. The Eevee opened its mouth and just managed to clamp down on one of those little wings that emitted the pale glow of moonlight. The Clefairy, its cries usually musical in nature, screeched more like a Zubat and whirled around to try and get the furry Eevee off its back. "Way to go, V!" Midori shouted from his relatively helpless position in the water. "Now, Luckwing! Supersonic the other one!" No longer being chased, the Zubat flew in a large loop that shot him back toward the water where the other Clefairy was just popping up. It opened its mouth and let out an awful sound. The Clefairy shook its head and then got ready to shoot up into the air to hit the Zubat, but instead it pushed itself deeper into the water, showing that the supersonic attack had been effective in confusing its opponent. "Great job! Now go help V!" The Zubat soared around to face the Clefairy just as it flung the pale Eevee from its wing. Luckwing dodged the flying Eevee, and then Midori shouted out a command, but at the exact same time a squeal of delight came from high above, and Violet's voice exclaimed,
I caught
"Leech
it!
life!"
I caught it!
Unable to hear Midori's commands, the Zubat faltered, allowing the Clefairy to get the upper hand and tackle the bat into the water. Midori felt like he was being pulled in two different directions. He wanted to shout congratulations to Violet, but he was also concerned about Luckwing and V. Wait! Ah! He started swimming over to where the Clefairy and Zubat went into the water, and V was already making his way back as well. Midori took a deep breath as he prepared to dive down after his Pokemon. Just before his ears were submerged, he heard a voice say,
Gotcha!
It was followed by a surprised shout from Violet that was abruptly cut off, and Midori didn't know if it was because of the water getting into his ears or if something terrible had just happened to the girl. The water was dark, and there really wasn't any way Midori could see anything. Fortunately, the wings of the Clefairy still glowed, and so he just aimed for that and hoped nothing else showed up down there. Swimming as hard as he could, he got closer and closer, and then grabbed hold tight of the Clefairy. The Clefairy wriggled in surprise, and then swam away as fast as it could back toward the surface, and there was no sign of Luckwing. Then something moved past him rapidly in the water, and he let out a lot of air in surprise. He had to surface quickly, and he wasn't sure he could make it in time. Something went by him again, and this time he felt a tentacle-like appendage wrap around his wrist and start pulling. Midori started to fight it until he realized it was pulling him toward the surface. He emerged and breathed in hard, getting some water drops in, causing him to erupt into a violent coughing fit. Once he stopped, he was already thinking about diving back down to rescue his Zubat when it screeched out at him and flew by his head. "Luckwing, you're okay!" V cried out from beside Midori, treading water and looking quite proud of itself. "You get him?" The Eevee gave a sound that seemed like a confirmation. "Then what was that Clefairy I grabbed?" "Oh, that must have been the confused one," Midori said. It was then that Midori realized there was a horsey floating nearby as well, and he knew it must be Mizu, who had probably been the one to help him back up to the surface. But something, or someone, was missing. "Where's Violet?" Mizu gave a series of cries and looked worriedly back up the cliff. Something had happened to her, and there was no way they were going to be able to climb that cliff. What had happened to Violet? And who was the other voice Midori had heard? Then there was a loud crack, and the cliff began to rise. Part 12. Chaotic Collisions. A spindly little plant with a yellow, bell-shaped head sprung along its roots down a long tunnel in the caves of Mount Moon, its eyes wide in panic.
Come back here!
Rushing after the Pokemon was a girl with dark pink hair, shouting after it. At the edge of a cliff, Violet was staring at a twitching Pokeball, her horsey, Mizu, nearby. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she anxiously hoped for the click of the Pokeball to tell her that the creature inside would stay. The voice coming from the tunnel did not penetrate her concentration. The Pokeball twitched. It twitched again.
Come on, come on!
And again. And... click! Violet froze. It took about a second and a half for everything to kick into gear. Her eyes flashed wide, and she leapt into the air, shouting,
I caught it! I caught it!
Just then, the frightened little plant skidded to a halt, sliding right into Violet's Pokeball and sending it flying right over the cliff. She opened her mouth to cry out, but just then the girl with the pink hair crashed into Violet and almost knocked her off the cliff. Pink Hair didn't notice at all, as her sights were set solely on the Pokemon.
Gotcha!
She snatched up the Bellsprout, while Violet whirled her arms like propellers, trying to keep from tipping over backwards. As she lost the battle of balance, she began to scream, but Pink Hair reached out and yanked her back quickly.
Are you okay?
Pink Hair asked. Violet had to take a couple of seconds to catch her breath, and let her mind catch up with the chaotic events that had just ensued. Her eyes noticed the Bellsprout that had been running scared was now in the clutches of the girl who had nearly knocked her off a cliff. She also remembered how the Bellsprout had knocked her newly captured Pokemon off the cliff in an attempt to escape Pink Hair. Violet frowned, pushed herself up on her feet and away from the newcomer.
I'm fine, no thanks to you.
Violet spat.
Hey, I just saved your life.
Violet blinked hard and gestured wildly at the cliff.
You were the one who almost killed me.
Pink Hair looked over at the cliff sheepishly.
Oh, well, yeah.
Then she quickly perked up and also got to her feet.
But actually, it was this one's fault if he hadn't run away from me.
She held out the Bellsprout and shook him in front of Violet. The poor Pokemon flopped around like a rag doll. Violet glared.
And why was that Pokemon running away, huh?
Violet started to reach for a Pokeball to toss, not realizing that her only available Pokemon was still outside the ball after the battle.
It looked pretty scared.
When her hand closed around air, Violet blinked and looked around the cliff for Mizu, who wasn't there.
Of course, Leafage was scared. He was being disobedient.
When the girl realized Violet wasn't paying attention to her anymore, she cocked her head sideways.
What are you doing?
Mizu? Mizu!
Violet turned in circles, glancing all around.
I'm looking for my horse.
Suddenly, she stopped and slowly turned a very dangerous-looking glare at Pink Hair.
You took him! Are you a Pokemon thief? Are you with that Rocket Gang?
What? I did not.
You probably were trying to steal my other Pokemon too, weren't you?
I'm not a thief.
Bending her knees and spreading her feet apart, Violet was ready to take on the pink-haired girl.
Uh-huh. You better tell me where Mizu is, or...
Suddenly, there was a buzzing sound behind Violet, and something large knocked into the back of her shoulder. As it continued its path, it turned around and hovered beside Pink Hair. The red and black creature looked like some kind of bug-type Pokemon, but not one Violet had ever recalled seeing or reading about. Then, before she could recover, another critter scurried between her legs, releasing a sudden spurt of fire that singed Violet's pant leg.
Ouch!
Look, I didn't want to come over here anyway. It was his idea, and now that I have him back, we'll be leaving.
No, I'm not letting you leave until you give me back my Pokemon.
Violet winced as she tried to move to block Pink Hair from leaving. Her leg still smarted where that other odd Pokemon had burned her. The pink-haired girl looked down at Violet's leg, and then at the girl's eyes.
You might want to put that out.
Put what out?
Violet asked as she looked down at her own leg. It turned out she hadn't been burned, but was burning in that moment. The Pokemon had lit her pant leg on fire. Violet jumped in shock and then fell backward into the tunnel and started patting at her leg violently to put out the flames. The pink-haired girl strolled on by, annoyed she had been accused of stealing Pokemon. She wrinkled her nose as she caught the scent of the burning leg.
Smell you later.
Growling, Violet worked harder to stop the fire. When it was out, she rolled up onto her hands and knees, staring down the tunnel. Pink Hair was already out of sight, but she couldn't be far. Violet shot up onto her feet and was about to run when pain shot through her body from the burn on her leg. It took her back down to one knee, and she clenched her teeth in fury. She opened her mouth and started to scream in anger when there was a loud crack. Violet blinked and looked all around.
What was that?
There was more sounds of crumbling rock and... was that a rush of water? Being a little more cautious of her leg, Violet hurried as fast as she could back to the edge of the cliff. She peered over, and her jaw dropped in shock. That underground lake, where her father and his Pokemon had been, had turned into a large whirlpool as the water level dropped. It was draining somehow, and caught somewhere inside was Midori. Part 13. Hopes Down the Drain. Despite how impossible it seemed, the cliff Midori had fallen from continued to rise higher and higher. It took him a full 5 seconds to realize that it wasn't rising at all, but that the water he was treading was lowering. When it clicked, he also noticed that it was beginning to pull him back. Both V and Mizu were looking behind Midori with wide, frightened eyes, and Luckwing shrieked above. When he turned around, he found that the water was beginning to swirl around more and more, with the center becoming the lowest point. More pieces fell into place, and Midori began to suspect that the crack he'd heard was the bottom of the lake breaking open, and the water was draining out. Unfortunately, knowing that didn't really help him, and as the water began to pick up speed, Midori found himself struggling to keep his head above water. Every so often he would catch glimpses of V and Mizu, but there wasn't much he could do for them. Mizu would probably be okay anyway, but V could just as likely drown as Midori, and Luckwing wasn't going to be able to hover above forever. Then the obvious came to mind, and, if Midori had the time, he would have smacked himself in the head for not thinking of it sooner. He would just return his Pokemon to their Pokeballs. He reached around to grab one, and then found himself losing it underwater as the whirlpool continued to try and drown him. "Oh, come on!" And in answer to his frustrated cry, Midori got a mouthful of underground lake. He choked it out and decided to try a different tactic. "Mizu!" he called out in between bouts of submersion. "Save V!" He hoped the horsey understood as he was running out of time and he needed to get something out to his Zubat. "Luckwing! Violet! Go!" The next time Midori's head was free from the water, he took a deep breath and decided to see if he could see anything down below. But, of course, the water was moving so much and it was a dark cave, so there wasn't really anything for him to see. And then there was a shock of pain on the back of his head. That was there for a moment, and then he felt nothing. At the top of the cliff, Violet pulled herself up the edge to see what was going on down below. She saw the whirlpool as the lake water drained away and no sign of her father. He was likely trapped in there somewhere, and there was nothing the poor girl could do about it. She didn't even have any of her Pokemon to offer any help. Her hands clutched so tight to the edge of the cliff that her knuckles turned white. "Wait! Right there! Is that? But no, it's gone." Violet had thought she'd seen her father, but it was hard to tell, and he was gone too fast. Then she thought she heard his voice. At a distance. What was he saying? It was all broken up by the sound of the draining water, and he was so far away. Soon after, there was a screech as something came flying up toward the cliff. As it drew closer, Violet knew it was a Zubat. And not just any Zubat, but Midori's Zubat.
Hey, hi.
Violet said as she tried to calm the creature as it nearly crashed into her. It was screeching wildly and flapping its wings in a panic.
What's happened? Where's Dad?
The Zubat screeched and flapped some more, and that did nothing to ease Violet's growing fears. She continued to try and calm the Zubat, despite not feeling calm herself, as she continued to watch the water drain. How much time passed, Violet didn't know. Everything had vanished except for the image of the draining water, despite it having stopped, as the lake was mostly empty now, some very shallow water remaining where it hadn't quite reached the hole. She wasn't even aware of her own body anymore, or that her hand was still petting the Zubat in what had started as an effort to soothe the Pokemon. In fact, the creature was now letting out a small, nasally snore as it had fallen asleep. As the ghostly image of the whirlpool repeated before her mind's eye, Violet also replayed the events of the day. How Mount Moon had started so easily and they had been so casual. Even the run-in with those thugs, while almost being deadly, had seemed so trifling. But now her dad was gone, and so was her partner, Mizu. The one she chose. And V, who she had grown up with. How could they all be gone? Tears began to stream down Violet's face, but she was still too lost to feel them. Nothing seemed real anymore. And her journey as a Pokemon trainer seemed so pointless before it even had a chance to begin. Obviously, losing her starter in the first few steps proved that she would amount to nothing and couldn't be trusted to care for these creatures. She just wanted to go home. But then, that thought itself brought an ache into her heart, because home didn't really exist anymore, not without V or her father. There was another pain that had started to spread as well. It started in her shoulder and seemed to start traveling down her arm. And then there was a loud, high-pitched screech next to her ear, and that was far more painful than whatever was wrong with her arm. Crashing back to reality, Violet blinked, her vision slightly blurry from the tears. The pain in her arm was the Zubat, awake again, clawing at her, and the sound had been it screeching right at her.
What do you want? Stop that, please.
Violet covered her ears with her hands, and the Zubat flew up into the air and soared down into the drained lake, circling around something. Blinking some more and wiping her eyes, Violet moved to get a better look to see what had made the Zubat so wild. And then her heart stopped. There was movement down there.
Dad?
She choked. It had been hardly more than a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again.
Dad? Dad, is that you? Are you okay?
There was no response. Violet waited, holding her breath and longing to hear her father say something, or even just groan out in pain. Any sound at all. And then, finally, there was a sort of hoarse sneeze, and the sad cry of an Eevee. Violet's heart broke all over again. She was so sure, or at least wanted to be sure, she would hear her dad, but no. It was V. But she couldn't wallow. V sounded sad and hurt and would need help, and would need Violet to be strong. But the poor girl wasn't sure she could do it. Swallowing hard, she called out again.
V? Is that you?
This time, V's voice came out a little clearer, and it was joined by another sound.
Mizu?
The horsey called out a few more times in the affirmative. Violet's heart lifted slightly at that. There was still tragedy, but at least not all had been lost. She began to sob and had to fight it back.
It's so good to hear you two. I'm going to find a way to get you out of there.
Both V and Mizu made some noises, and the Zubat joined in. They were trying to tell her something.
What? What is it? I don't understand.
They darted off toward the hole, where the water drained, and the Zubat followed.
You want to go down there? But that might be dangerous.
Finally, V chirped up at the Zubat, who screeched back, and then dove into the hole.
Lucky! What are you...
But it was too late. He was gone. But the two Pokemon did not seem concerned and simply turned back to look up at Violet.
What is going on with you?
Suddenly, there was a Zubat screech behind Violet that almost scared her right down the cliff, and Lucky flew back from the tunnel they had all come through earlier. Then it clicked. They already had a way out. They just wanted to let her know so they could meet up.
I see. All right, I'll see you back at the intersection.
The reunion was a joyous one, and Violet wasted no time scooping up the soggy Eevee and her horsey and hugging them tightly. Her father was still gone, and that hurt. A lot. But she needed to be brave for her companions, and it turned out she had not failed as a trainer.
All right, guys. It's time to get out of this mountain. What do you say?
The three Pokemon all gave their individual cries of agreement.
Yeah? Let's go and collect those badges. It's what Dad would have wanted.
And so, that young girl and her 3 companions took the next steps on their journey, where many more adventures were waiting for them. A young girl emerged from one side of Mount Moon near a Pokemon Center. Riding on one shoulder was a Horsey. A Zubat flew overhead, and weaving around her feet was an Eevee, but with pale fur. High above them, standing on the edge of a cliff, someone watched them with curiosity. So, Midori has a daughter. Very interesting. Who's Midori? A familiar, deep voice spoke up. There was a smack as a third member of this group slaps the second man in the back of the head. The guy we ran into in the caves, you buffoon! Oh, the one that summoned the bats? He didn't summon them, you... Quiet, both of you. Sorry, sir. Yeah, sorry. But where is he now? He was in Mount Moon with her. Oh, but of course. He probably expects me to be here, and he's still hiding. Well, Midori, then you only have yourself to blame for what happens to your daughter. Part 14. R&R. Just outside of the Mount Moon Caves, there was a Pokemon Center, which is just what Violet needed. She and her 3 companions were weary, both physically and emotionally. Entering the building, she found several other trainers and travelers inside, and she quickly scanned the lobby for any sign of pink hair. There wasn't, and Violet couldn't tell if she was disappointed or not. For one, she wanted to give pink hair a piece of her mind, but, on the other hand, she was just too tired. Stepping up to the counter, Violet placed down 3 Pokeballs. She was given a pickup ticket, and the 3 Pokeballs were carted off with her 3 Pokemon inside. Then she looked for a place to sit and maybe even take a nap, and found there weren't any empty seats. She let out a sigh and headed for a wall that she could sit against instead. But before she could get there, a balding man popped up in her path wearing a large grin. Hello, miss. Have I got a deal for you? He stopped suddenly and looked around cautiously, as if he thought someone might be watching him. And then he beckoned Violet to follow him over to the corner, which is basically where she had been trying to head in the first place. Once they were there, he leaned in real close and spoke just above a whisper. I've got a real special Pokemon, and I'm willing to part with it for just 500. What do you say? Violet's eyes widened, and she was suddenly more alert. Blinking a few times, she shook her head.
500? I don't have that kind of money on me.
The sudden exclamation made the man jump, and his smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. Of course. He brought his voice back down and made another attempt. I see. You're probably just getting started on your journey. So, just for you, I could go as low as 350. How can you pass that up? I'll tell you how. You can't! You'd have to have your brain taken out for you to lose out on such a deal! The girl frowned.
Look, I really don't...
All right, you drive a hard bargain. 200, final offer. The annoyance Violet felt was increased by her exhaustion. She ran a hand down her face as she wondered why this guy had targeted her. Then a hand came down on the man's shoulder and a calm but firm voice spoke. Know when to let go, friend. It is clear the lady is not interested. The shorter salesman looked up at the man who wore a pleasant smile and a handsome face whose ice-blue eyes met his brown ones. The salesman made to move his shoulder but found it locked firm in the newcomer's grip. Turning toward the front doors at the center, the newcomer gestured toward them and said, Please, it is a beautiful day outside, and I am certain you will find the sunshine to brighten your mood. But I have this... Please, sir, I insist. The salesman winced a little and then nodded. Oh, yeah, sure, all right. He collected a fishing pole and tackle box and then headed for the exit, taking one last glance at Violet and the man that had come to her rescue before he left.
Thank you, mister.
The stranger pulled his suit coat tight, ran his hands down the sides to smooth it out, and smiled a very charming smile. Don't mention it. Young Pokemon trainers have it hard enough when they're getting started that they don't need riffraff like him preying upon their inexperience or taking advantage of their exhaustion. Violet furrowed her brow.
And what makes you think I'm inexperienced?
She crossed her arms, a little annoyed that this man just assumed she was young and just starting out. Oh, I apologize profusely. The man's eyes went wide, surprised at the sudden change in demeanor. I hadn't meant any offense at all, miss. I had foolishly made an assumption simply based on the
the way I
fact that
look,
you only
right?
turned
Just some
in
little
3
girl.
Pokeballs. Huh?
What?
Both went silent for a moment and stared at one another, trying to process what the other had been saying.
How
A
did
little
you know
girl?
I had 3?
I don't. They both chuckled a little as they continued to speak at the same time.
You
I'm
go
sorry, you
first.
should. They stopped once again before the man started to open his mouth. He seemed uncertain if he should, and then Violet also opened her mouth, stopping him short, and then she laughed when she had succeeded in faking him out. He smiled and let out another soft chuckle. You got me. As I was saying, normally, by the time a trainer has collected 2 badges, they have already caught themselves at least 6 Pokemon, so it would seem you are still on your way to badge number 2. Violet was flattered. He had not thought she looked too young, but had reached a likely conclusion through observation that she had less than 6 Pokemon. On top of that, he had apparently thought she had some skill, as he believed her to have at least 1 badge. That was a point she thought she should correct.
Actually, I don't have any badges yet. I'm still headed to my first gym in Pewter City.
The man was astonished. You haven't even... But, did you get lost? How did you miss Pewter City, or... No. You couldn't have come through Mount Moon already, with no badges? A little redness creeped into Violet's face, and she looked down.
Well, actually, yeah, I did. We...
She trailed off as she had been about to clarify that she hadn't done it alone, but her father had been with her. Until now, she had been distracted by the pushy salesman and the gentleman rescuer, but the events of Mount Moon came back, and it stung. The man seemed to notice a change, and he scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. Hey, miss, are you...
Trainer Violet, Trainer Violet.
A woman behind the counter was scanning the lobby, holding out a tray that contained 3 Pokeballs.
Trainer Violet, your Pokemon are ready. I'm sorry.
Violet said, on the verge of tears.
I have to go.
She ran over to the counter and collected her companions, and then rushed out of the Pokemon Center, not even noticing the gentleman reach out and try to hail her back. Hey, wait! Outside of the Pokemon Center, she nearly collided with someone and started to apologize.
Excuse me, I'm so...
But she trailed off when she found out who it was she ran into. A tall, beefy-looking guy in all black turned and grinned down at the girl. Right on the front of his outfit was the telltale letter that marked him as a member of Team Rocket, and it was a similar shirt to the one worn by his partner, who was coming in from Violet's right. And then, even more shocking, was that to her left, his R hidden a bit behind a vest, was the pushy salesman. Part 15. Sleepy Time. Well, well, well. Look what we have here, the largest of the 3 Team Rocket goons said as he looked down at Violet. He was built like a brick wall and positioned perfectly to be such a barrier between the girl and the route ahead of her. His partner from Mount Moon and the Magikarp salesman made up the other 2 and were closing in from either side. Running different options through her mind, she briefly considered retreating back into the Pokemon Center, but wasn't sure she could get there in time, and that those 3 would still be lurking outside, waiting for her. There was a chance she could dive between Mr. Wall's legs, but if that failed, it would just make her that much easier to grab.
All right.
She thought to herself.
I'll need to rely on my 3 companions then.
She swallowed hard and tried to think of which Pokemon she should release first, and how they would be most effective. She looked at the path she was on and saw it was paved.
Perfect.
Violet knew as soon as she went for the Pokeballs, everything would happen fast, and so she took a deep breath, tried to calm her nerves, before she made any move other than the slow steps backward as each of the Team Rocket members inched closer. She reached for 2 Pokeballs at the same time and aimed one right in front of her and the other to her left.
Mizu, bubble the ground. V, quick attack.
Once the Pokemon were out, she quickly put the balls away and went for the last one. All 3 men began to charge forward, just as she hoped. The Horsey's bubble attack made the path in front of Mr. Wall slick, and his feet flew up right in front of him. His cry as he fell to the ground was amusingly high-pitched for such a large man. Meanwhile, his partner was suddenly attacked by V as he came forward. Violet started to pull the last ball out, but found her wrist suddenly caught in the grip of the salesman. Nice moves, girl, but not quick. Wasting no time, Violet kicked the salesman right in the shin. Her arm was immediately free, and she aimed the last Pokeball in the air.
Lucky, supersonic.
The Zubat shot upward and then flapped around and seemed a little lost. Then it flew down and dug its fangs into the salesman.
Okay, that works, I guess.
Mizu hopped up onto Violet's shoulder as she ran around the big guy who was rolling over to push himself back up.
All right, let's go.
The Zubat flew off of the salesman and followed above, and V was zigzagging around, trying hard to not let the other Team Rocket goon catch him. Violet aimed his Pokeball back at him, and the beam of light shot out and encompassed the pale Eevee and brought him back safely into his ball. "Get her!" screamed the man as he ran past his larger partner, who was now getting a hand up from the salesman. Violet took one look to see him leading the way and the other two lagging behind in pursuit, and so she turned around and pushed her legs harder. She leapt from a small ledge and into some tall grass and then ducked and held as close to the rock wall as she could. A screech from above reminded her that the Zubat was still out, and so she quickly aimed his Pokeball up and returned him. She tried to breathe as softly as she could as her lungs reached out for as much oxygen as they could get. There was a small rustle nearby, and Violet nearly bolted, but stopped short, realizing her pursuers were likely not sneaking up to her in the small patch of grass. Curious, she tried to look without moving from her spot, and, really, trying not to move at all. She could see something between the blades of grass, but it was hard to make out. Then, a very pleasant and soothing sound floated toward her from that direction. The next thing Violet knew was that she was staring up at the stars in the night sky. Her mouth stretched into a large yawn, and her arms reached out at the same time. Mizu was next to her and was sleeping quite peacefully. The girl sat up with a jolt as she remembered she was being chased. But, as she looked around, she also remembered it had not been dark out before. Slowly it dawned on her that she must have fallen asleep while waiting for Team Rocket to pass, but that seemed strange. Had she really been that exhausted? Still perplexed by her situation, Violet slowly peeked up over the ledge to see if anyone was around. There wasn't. Standing up and brushing some of the dirt off her clothes, she noticed marks in her arms where grass had been pressed for a while, and it was clear that more than a few minutes had certainly passed. She tried to think about the moments preceding her drifting off into slumber, and then she recalled the rustling grass and the creature hidden in there.
It was pink, right?
She wondered to herself.
And then there was that sound, like a song. Oh.
Violet thought back to her studies and recalled that some Pokemon could sing, and it was said some were powerful enough to not just put other Pokemon to sleep, but people, too.
I was Jigglypuffed, wasn't I?
She shook her head, slightly amused. After all, at least she hadn't been found by Team Rocket. Violet sighed and scooped up her horsey, gently coaxing him awake.
I know it's late, Mizu, but we should keep going. I don't want to stay in one spot too long with those rocket guys after us.
The horsey blinked its bleary eyes and looked around as if trying to understand where it was and how it got there. Mizu's face took on a more peaceful expression when Violet placed it on her shoulder, which had become a familiar and comfortable place.
All right, now it looks like Pewter City is just straight west from here,
Violet said as she consulted her map.
As long as we don't meet any more trouble along the way, we should be there in no time.
No time is right, as in you'll never make it there. Not if I have anything to say about it. Part 16. The Brat's Rat. Emerging from the shadows cast by a large cliff was a young man with a backwards baseball cap. He kept tossing a Pokeball up in the air, catching it each time, as he walked toward the middle of the path. Once he was directly in Violet's way, he thrust his Pokeball forward in a dramatic pose and said, "I challenge you to a Pokemon battle!" Violet's heart had stopped for a moment or two when she had first heard the voice, fearing that one of the Team Rocket goons had been waiting for her. When it turned out to just be a boy around her own age, she let out a sigh of relief. Relief turned to annoyance, and she rolled her eyes at the boy's challenge.
Look, I don't have time for this right now. I just want to get to Pewter City, and there are these guys.
Ha! If you're too afraid to battle me, what makes you think you can take on a great gym leader like Brock?
What?
Violet blinked her eyes and shook her head.
Afraid? I'm not afraid. I just told you I don't have
Okay, then prove it. Prove you're not afraid. Shaking her head, Violet moved to walk around the boy, but he slid over to get in her way again.
Isn't it past your bedtime?
The boy looked at her, offended, for just a second, and then he said, "You're the same age. Wouldn't it be past—" Violet capitalized on the distraction and stepped to the right, but quickly shifted to the left and went around the annoying obstacle. Hey! Violet grinned as she ignored the boy and continued walking away. But then she heard him cry out again, and she knew she wasn't going to be rid of him as easily as she hoped. Rattata, go! Throwing her head back in frustration, Violet turned around and said,
Mizu, bubble.
The horsey leapt down and prepared to spray, but in that time the boy shouted out his own command, Quick attack! The Rattata was suddenly coming in from the side and smacked the horsey. Reeling around, Horsey was able to direct the bubble toward Rattata and still hit the little creature as well.
Okay, there. We battled a little. Can we be...
Quick attack again! Violet groaned in annoyance.
Mizu, return.
A light shone around the horsey and it retreated back into its Pokeball, and then a different Pokemon emerged. The Rattata swiped at the pale Eevee that now stood in Mizu's place.
Quick attack!
Now 2 Pokemon were zooming around, trying to get a hit at one another. The boy's strategy of just using Quick Attack had met its match since V was faster. After a few rounds with the Eevee, the boy's Rattata could barely stand and was breathing hard.
Can we call it now? You're clearly beaten.
It's not fair! You used 2 Pokemon against my 1! Violet cocked an eyebrow.
Not fair? It's not my fault you decided to battle me when you only had 1 Pokemon.
But it's just supposed to be a one-on-one battle!
You never said that. I never agreed to any such thing. In fact, I never even
It doesn't need to be said. Everyone does it that way.
What? No, they...
Violet abruptly closed her mouth when she realized she was caught in a pointless argument, and they were all making a lot of noise when the last thing she wanted was any kind of attention.
V, return.
In a flash, the Eevee was back in its Pokeball, and Violet had turned and started back on her path. Hey, you can't just leave. You owe me.
I don't owe you anything. And I already told you I don't have time for this.
Violet called back. Oh yeah? Well, I'll just...
What? Throw another Pokemon at me? Oh wait, you don't have any more.
He had realized that Violet was right, and there wasn't really anything he could do. She grinned triumphantly, and was more than happy to leave that obnoxious trainer behind. The sense of satisfaction lasted all of about 5 minutes, and then everything was quiet again, and there were many shadows along her path where anyone could be hiding. Every so often she would hear a sound, usually out in some tall grass. Sometimes it was the passing of a Zubat in the night sky. While the boy had been a pest, it would have probably been best for both of them not to be alone out there in the middle of the night, especially her when there were those with ill intent looking for her. Violet was on high alert, a hand always resting on a Pokeball so that she could toss it the instant trouble showed up. She ducked as another Zubat screeched by above, and then something burst right out of a nearby patch of grass. It zoomed straight for the girl. She whipped out the Pokeball, and Mizu launched out to meet the enemy. Part 17. Spear Me, the Drama. Mizu's eyes flashed wide in surprise at appearing right in front of a missile. The object's scream sounded very bird-like, and, just before it struck the horsey, she could tell that it was a Pokemon. Violet winced as her horsey took the full blow and was knocked aside.
Sorry.
The attacker curved upward into the air, causing a Zubat to quickly change direction, and then the creature shot back down to continue its assault on Violet and her Pokemon.
Mizu, get up and hit it with your bubble attack.
The horsey bounced up and took aim and started spraying bubbles upward towards the bird. As they popped in the Pokemon's face, it veered off to the side and plowed into the ground. Violet and Mizu were sprayed by chunks of dirt from where the bird Pokemon had crashed. It flapped its wings wildly, and its talons scraped and scratched as it worked to pull its beak out. Once free, the Spearow raised its beak to the sky and gave out a loud victory cry. Not thrilled with all the noise again, Violet winced and hissed a command to her horsey.
Mizu, quick, quiet it down with a bubble.
The horsey obeyed immediately and sent a stream of bubbles toward the Spearow. The bird choked on the sudden suds and flapped up into the air. It dove toward Mizu, who launched another bubble attack, but this time the Spearow managed to scratch up the horsey with its beak.
Are you doing okay, Mizu?
The horsey gave a determined snort and positioned itself for another attack as the Spearow turned and sort of growled at the water Pokemon.
All right, let him have it.
One more shot of bubbles to the face seemed to annoy the Spearow, and it flapped its wings and started to rise back into the air, but slower, and the wings were not flapping at a steady pace.
I think we have him, Mizu. Hold back.
The Spearow locked its eyes on Mizu and seemed ready to strike again, but Violet had pulled out an empty Pokeball and was ready to launch it. The bird dove toward its target, and Violet tossed the ball. Mizu could see the Spearow coming closer, and finally she closed her eyes tight, bracing for the collision, and then snap! The Pokeball collided with the Spearow and sucked the bird inside before landing on the ground next to Mizu. The light flashed once, and only once, before the telltale click signaled Violet's second capture. The girl ran forward and picked up the Pokeball.
We did it, Mizu!
Violet beamed down at her partner, who looked back up just as pleased, but a little exhausted.
You did great. Why don't you get some rest now?
She aimed Mizu's Pokeball at her, and the horsey vanished inside. Before taking off, Violet put the Pokeball with the newly captured Pokemon away before it too got lost due to a freak appearance of a Bellsprout or something like what happened to her Clefairy. Once everything was settled, she continued to trek toward Pewter City and decided to bring out Lucky for some company since the Zubat would probably be best suited for an evening stroll. The rest of the journey came without any real incident. There had been an encounter with a Pidgey at one point, but she had it battered too badly that it fled before she could try and capture it. Once she arrived in town, she headed straight for the Pokemon Center and turned in her Pokemon to get refreshed, and then she acquired a room so she could get some rest as well. After all, she and her Pokemon would want to be in tip-top shape to challenge Brock, the Pewter City gym leader. The next morning, Violet rushed back to the Pokemon Center counter and collected her 4 Pokeballs. She was bouncing with excitement as she gathered her companions. She was so close to finally taking on her first gym, and she really wanted to win. She needed to collect all 8 badges across the land to earn the right to face the Elite Four. Walking through town, she noticed a museum along the way, and she looked to Mizu.
That looks interesting. Maybe we should check it out after the battle.
Mizu sounded off in agreement. With her eyes on the museum and her mind on the upcoming gym battle, Violet did not notice the person coming around the corner of the Pewter City gym building. She and the person collided hard, butting heads and falling to the ground.
Ow! Watch where you're going! Watch where I'm going!
Sitting on the ground right across from Violet was the last person she wanted to see. Well, maybe not the last, but she wasn't far from the bottom. It was the girl with the pink hair who had nearly killed her in Mount Moon. Part 18. Pink Hair Returns. Violet sat on the ground behind the Pewter City gym, glaring at the pink-haired girl who had just knocked her over for the second time. She, too, was sitting in the dirt and staring back at Violet. After a handful of seconds passed by, they both got to their feet slowly.
You have got to be the clumsiest trainer I've ever met. You nearly knocked me off a cliff last time, and your Pokemon are just as... Wait, what?
Pink-Hair jumped back, her eyes going wide.
What?
Did you just say you have a badge?
Violet's teeth were clenched hard.
Oh, yeah! I just beat Brock and got my Boulder badge.
It was all Violet could do not to scream in frustration. She did not like the girl with pink hair, and now she learned that she was walking in her shadow, and would be for a while if she didn't find a way to catch up.
It was kind of a crazy battle. Fire Edge and Strawberry were not great for dealing with rock and ground attacks, but Lala, my Jigglypuff, helped with its singing, and then Leaf Edge was fantastic. Oh, hey, did you want to battle? We could get some practice in before I head off to the next gym in Cerulean City.
Violet was shaking and didn't dare open her mouth lest she start shouting. Pink Hair frowned and took another step back, possibly wondering if Violet was about to explode like a Voltorb.
Or not. We don't have to. I just thought it would be good for us to keep sharpening our skills. Oh, hey, how many badges do you have? Maybe we're not even at the same level, or maybe we are and you got lost and skipped over Pewter City by accident, just like I did. Probably not, though. I don't think that happens to a lot of people. Oh, I'm Hanako, by the way.
The girl extended a hand to shake Violet's. When Violet simply glared down at it, Hanako slowly retracted it.
Maybe I should just go.
The girl dipped her head and quieted down.
Sorry again for running into you. Bye.
She gave a small wave and made her way in the direction of the Pokemon Center. Violet didn't even watch her leave. She was fuming inside and was even more annoyed that the girl was acting all friendly and nice.
She wouldn't be so pleasant if I was ahead of her in badges, and I bet she doesn't have Team Rocket chasing after her or had her father drown in...
Violet trailed off as the memory of that particular incident stabbed through her heart.
Okay, Violet, we can't think about that. Stay strong. Stay focused.
She took a deep breath and continued around the building and came to the front door of the Pokemon gym. She stared at the door for about a minute before reaching out one trembling hand and yanking it open. Stepping inside, she could see a handful of trainers battling one another with rock Pokemon, and Violet had to assume they were being trained in by Brock, the gym leader. There were a couple of statues near the front with a plaque that listed Brock as the leader of that gym, and standing near them was a man in glasses, and he called out to Violet, "Yo, champ in the making!" Violet looked around, and confirming the guy was addressing her, she walked over, carefully looking for any sign of an R on his clothing. Come on, don't take all day." When Violet finally reached him, he held out his hand. "All right, let me see your Pokedex." She slowly handed it over. "You're registered, right?" The girl thought for a minute, uncertain, and started to nod. The man lost interest as he hit a few buttons on the Pokedex and nodded himself. "Yep, all right. Violet from Cerulean City. Currently 0 badges. This is your first gym then, I take it?"
Yes?
Okay, so this is the Pewter City gym. Brock is the gym leader and rock type are his speciality.
Yeah, I know.
The man lowered his head and peered over his glasses. "Oh, you know, do you? Good for you! Now don't interrupt me, Miss Smarty Pants." Violet frowned. She was astonished at just how many people out in the world were really rude and annoying. "Oh, and rock-type Pokemon are pretty susceptible to water and grass attacks, so I'd recommend using those if you have any. Meanwhile, normal attacks won't work great against the rock-hard bodies of these Pokemon, and Pokemon like bug-types and flying types could really get crushed here." Not sure if he was finished, Violet continued to stand there, eyebrows raised at him as he dispensed a bunch of information she already knew. "Well, don't just stand there, go on in. Be warned, though, you'll have to face a trainer or two before getting to Brock." Now that was something she had not known. Violet walked farther into the gym, and sure enough, she was challenged by a trainer just a few feet in. However, Mizu made short work of his Geodude. A few bubble attacks from the Horsey was all it really took to soften up those rockheads. The rest of the trainers were either preoccupied or maybe thought it was pointless to go up against her water Pokemon, leaving her path clear to reach Brock. "Hi, welcome to the Pewter City Gym. Are you ready to take me on?" Violet nodded. Though, even with the type advantage, she did not feel certain this was going to go in her favor.
But that pink-haired girl did it, so it should be easy.
She thought to herself. "All right, you can use up to 6 Pokemon if you have them. I will just be using 2, but they are very strong. Good luck." Violet's first instinct was to toss out Mizu again and just drench whatever rock Pokemon Brock threw at her. But she had second thoughts, worried by Brock's words. If his Pokemon were well trained, which they probably were, she feared Mizu might be taken out too early. Making a decision, she reached for a Pokeball and held it up. Brock did the same. They both approached the center of the battlefield and crossed arms. The man with the glasses stepped out to the side of the field and announced, "The match is about to begin. At the count of 3, you will both release your Pokemon. 1, 2, 3! The Pokeballs dropped. Part 19. Battling Brock. As the Pokeballs fell, Brock quickly backed up to his end of the battlefield. The less experienced Violet stood there and watched to see what Pokemon would emerge from the gym leader's Pokeball. Exploding out was a serious-looking Geodude, and Violet's Spearow shot out to meet him. The girl had not had time to really work with her new bird Pokemon, but she wasn't planning on it winning the fight. She just needed a buffer to see what she was dealing with. "Ha! Interesting choice," Brock called out. "But you should know, Rock-type are resistant to normal and Flying-type attacks."
Right, I forgot about that.
Violet scolded herself for not thinking it all the way through. But she had never taken on a gym leader before, and she was desperate to win since that pink-haired girl had already done it. In fact, it was all Pink Hair's fault anyway, for getting in her head. Normally, Violet would have been smarter than that. Geodude! Defense girl! The Geodude curled up, covering up his face, which was likely where he was most vulnerable. Violet looked confused.
Why didn't he send his Pokemon into attack?
She shrugged and shouted out a command to Spearow.
Peck that Geodude!
The Spearow shot into the air and then zoomed down toward the boulder Pokemon and brought its sharp beak down hard. It then cried out in shock and pain while the Geodude didn't even flinch. Violet knew it wouldn't do much to the opponent, especially in that defensive stance, but she figured it would have at least been acknowledged. Tighten up that defense, Geodude! The Pokemon obeyed and wrapped its arms around itself even tighter. This continued lack of attacking really baffled the girl, but as she opened her mouth to give out a new command, she realized her mistake.
Alright, let's go again. No wait! Spearow, growl!
Changing directions midway sent the bird in a circle, confused for a moment, but then it caught up with what it was being told and growled at the boulder beneath it. Brock grinned as he looked across the field to his opponent. Ah! Maybe you do know a thing or two about battles. The gym leader cracked his knuckles and then shouted out, All right, Geodude, time to tackle! For a rock, the Pokemon was fast. It shot into the air and collided hard with Spearow, knocking the bird to the ground. It got up and flapped some dust off itself and into Violet's eyes. Wiping it away, she realized she needed to back up instead of standing right in the middle of the battle zone. She told Spearow to growl again, which it did while taking another hit from Geodude. Spearow seemed to weather it a bit better that time, being on the ground. But then it took off to circle the boulder to growl again. The next tackle returned Spearow to the dirt floor, and this time it struggled mightily to pick itself up. It needed to get out of there soon, or it would be too battered to even remember a battle had taken place.
Way to go, Spearow. It's time to come back.
She held out the Pokeball, and a beam of light collected the bird and brought it back to safety within its Pokeball. Violet threw out another Pokeball, releasing her father's Zubat.
Go Lucky!
Another flyer, huh? Interesting choice. Is that all you've got on you?
Wouldn't you like to know?
Violet crossed her arms and stared the gym leader down. Brock shrugged and then issued another tackle command to his Geodude. Zubat was hit, but then with a command of
Leech Life!
It dove in and latched onto the rock, draining some of its energy away for itself. Then the Geodude grabbed Zubat's wing and threw the creature to the ground and jumped on top of it. Had it hit just as hard as the other tackles, it would have been hard to keep going, leeching life every chance it could get. But this was even harder, and Violet wasn't even sure she should keep the poor thing out there. But she had a plan, and she wanted to see it through. The question was if the Zubat could even pull it off. He seemed confused the last time Violet tried the command. She crossed her fingers and said,
Lucky, Supersonic!
The sound was so shrill and painful that Violet covered her ears and winced. When it stopped, she looked up to see if it had even worked, but couldn't tell from Geodude's expression. That's enough! Geodude, end this! The rock Pokemon nodded, and then that's when Violet saw it. Its eyes had drifted slightly when it had done that. It was having a tough time concentrating. The Supersonic had worked!
Well, stop that Geodude? How confused is it?
Geodude tried to lock its eyes on the Zubat, but struggled to focus. Then, in a flash, it charged forward, leapt, and landed on the other side of the Zubat and rolled right into a wall, knocking itself out.
Yes!
Nicely done! Brock returned Geodude and then grabbed his next Pokeball to toss out. In that moment, Violet took the opportunity to quickly return the Zubat and send out another Pokemon herself. Now let's see how you handle... He tossed the Pokeball, and it burst open, releasing a huge Pokemon that, at first, Violet thought might just be a stack of Geodudes. But it wasn't that at all. It was... Onix! Part 20. Bubble Pummel. Violet's jaw dropped as the awesome creature towered over the battlefield. She figured Brock would throw out more rock Pokemon, but she had not expected to see something so huge and powerful. A small sound chirped up from the bottom of the rock snake, and Violet suddenly remembered where she was and what she was supposed to be doing.
Right, sorry.
She glanced over at her partner, who also seemed to be a little nervous to be standing in the shadow of the Onix opponent.
Mizu,
Tackle it now, Onix! The large rock Pokemon aimed its head downward and shot down toward the little horsey. It let out a high pitch as it was knocked across the arena, where it landed hard.
Mizu, are you okay?
The horsey sat up and shook off the dust, and then it narrowed its eyes hard at the Onix. It gave another cry to let Violet know it was ready. Violet nodded in return.
Alright, let's do this. Mizu, dodge Onix's attacks, and give it a barrage of bubbles.
The water Pokemon obeyed immediately, looking more determined than it ever had before. The Onix tried to tackle the horsey repeatedly, but it kept zigzagging across the arena, taking shots at Onix whenever it had lunged and missed.
Mizu is doing great.
Violet thought to herself.
Everything we've gone through together since leaving Cerulean is really showing.
Violet thought that Onix was beginning to look tired, and it seemed confirmed when Brock changed tactics. "All right, Onix, screech!" The rock Pokemon stopped and turned to stare right at Mizu. It opened its mouth, and an ear-splitting screaming burst forth. Violet covered her ears, wincing at the pain. The horsey stopped short and tried to curl itself into a ball to shield it from that awful noise. "Now get that horsey before it can recover!" Onix charged forward and hit the horsey hard, causing it to start off rolling away, and then, when it could no longer maintain its rolled-up form, the Pokemon flipped around and skidded to a halt. Mizu looked very battered.
Mizu, can you hear me?
Violet looked at her Pokemon worried. Had she pushed her Pokemon too far? How badly did the Onix hurt her horsey?
Please be okay, please be okay.
A little cry from the water Pokemon, and then it started to shift a little. Mizu was trying to get back up. Violet wanted more than anything to rush out and help. She wanted to pick it up and rush it right over to the Pokemon Center, but that would be the end of the match right there. Instead, Violet would just have to call Horsey back and hope one of her other Pokemon were able to finish off Onix.
All right, Mizu.
Twisting on the spot, Mizu glared back at its trainer, stopping the girl short, her Pokeball half raised. After what felt like a full minute, Mizu seemed satisfied that Violet was going to respect its wishes and let it stay in the fight.
Mizu is going to keep fighting?
Violet was having trouble believing what she was seeing. She also was torn on if she should let it happen. The poor horsey could get itself killed. Violet would rather lose than see that happen, but if she called it back now, Mizu might not forgive her.
Okay, you can do this.
When Brock saw the horsey march back into battle, he issued another command to his Pokemon. "Onix, bide!" Violet's eyes went wide. This could be it. If Mizu couldn't finish off Onix fast enough, there was no way Mizu would be able to take the next hit from Onix.
Let's do it, Mizu. Pummel him with Bubble.
Mizu charged forward and shot another stream of bubbles at the rock Pokemon, softening him up even more. The Onix watched as the horsey circled it as it got ready to strike. Another stream of bubbles hit, and Onix was still upright. He shifted slightly, and Violet knew this was it. Brock's champion was going to strike. It locked its eyes on its target, and there was a grating sound as the boulders shifted slightly as Onix tensed up. The match was seconds away from being over.
Mizu, one more bubble, quick!
Onix snapped, his head lunging at lightning speed toward the much smaller horsey. And then more bubbles than ever before streamed from the little Pokemon's snout and covered the Onix and the surrounding area. There was a loud crash, and dust flew up into the air everywhere, latching on to the swarm of bubbles. Nothing could be seen. Both Pokemon were completely concealed, and the last echoes of that crash started to drift away. Violet hung her head. Onix had been heading straight for Horsey, and that crashing noise could only have been made by such a large Pokemon. She had lost, and, worse yet, she may have lost her Pokemon.
Just let Mizu be alive, please!
Violet pleaded quietly to herself. The bubbles began to pop, releasing the sand trapped inside them, and slowly the veil was vanishing. Violet could see parts of Onix starting to appear at the higher points where the dust was less thick. Then there was a sort of shuffling noise. Was Onix starting to rise again? He looked too still for that. Then Violet saw a small, sand-covered figure scooting warily out of the dust and toward her.
Mizu!
Forgetting all about the match, Violet rushed forward and scooped her Pokemon into her arms.
Oh, Mizu, you're okay!
She looked down at the exhausted horsey and brushed some of the sand off her and noticed all the scratches and bruises.
Well, you're alive, and you will be okay. It's over now.
Well, looks like congratulations are in order. That is one tough horsey you got there. Violet looked up and saw a really blurry person in front of her. At least, she thought it was a person. It seemed almost formless. That's when she realized that she must have been crying. She had been so happy Mizu was okay. She blinked a couple of times and ran an arm across them and was able to start making out more details. Here, you have certainly earned this. It was Brock, and he was trying to hand her something.
What?
Violet had been so focused on Mizu's well-being it was taking her a minute to understand what was going on. Then she recognized that it was a badge resting in Brock's hand.
The boulder badge? Why? Wait, did I win?
Well, yeah, of course you did, Brock laughed. I don't just hand these out to anyone. Violet blinked in surprise. Then she snatched up the badge and started jumping up and down, much to the discomfort of Mizu.
I won! I won! I won! I won!
Whoa, easy there. I think your horsey needs to rest a minute. And in the future, you might not want to push it so hard. She stopped and looked down at Horsey, who was wincing a little.
Right. Sorry, Mizu.
Violet looked up at Brock.
To you too, Brock. I'm sorry. But you see, you're wrong. I didn't win. Mizu wanted to push through. I was going to call it back, even if it meant losing. So I didn't win. We won. Me and my Pokemon.
Brock nodded seriously. I'm impressed. You show better understanding about the relationship between Pokemon and their trainers than some adults I've met. Violet smiled, but it was a sad sort of smile.
I had a good teacher.
Then, with badge pinned on and Mizu cradled in her arms, Violet left the gym, and she whispered to herself,
Thanks, Dad.
To be continued.